Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into the arguments presented in a fascinating work called The Quran and Science. It's by a doctor named Maurice Bucaille, and it explores the surprising connections between modern scientific discoveries and a holy book from the 7th century. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the main claim of the book. Then we'll look at the evidence it presents from cosmology, geology, and even biology. After that, we'll see how it compares the Quran to the Bible, and we'll wrap it all up with the author's final big conclusion. Let's get into it. So first up, let's get our heads around the fundamental argument being made here by the author, a French medical doctor named Maurice Bucaille. And this quote right here, it really gets to the heart of the whole thing. The entire premise rests on this one powerful idea, that the Quran contains statements about science that the author argues were just impossible for any human to have known back in the 7th century. So let's be super clear about the main thesis. The author's goal isn't to use science to prove religion. Instead, he's presenting what he sees as scientific facts found inside the Quran as evidence for what he believes is its divine authenticity. It's a subtle but really important distinction. All right, let's jump into the first big area of evidence the source brings up, and it's a big one, the cosmos. We're talking about the creation of the universe itself. Now, a key point of interpretation the author makes right away has to do with this word ayam. When the Quran mentions creation in 6 ayam, the source argues this doesn't mean 6 24-hour days. No, it means vast, long periods of time, like geological or astronomical ages. And from there, the book points to these verses that describe an initial smoke, or gaseous mass, and a moment where the heavens and the earth were all fused together before being split apart. The author draws a direct line from these ancient descriptions to our modern cosmological ideas, like a primary nebula and, of course, the Big Bang Theory. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The source highlights this distinction the Quran makes between the sun and the moon. See, it uses completely different Arabic words for them. It calls the sun a siraj, like a fiery lamp that produces its own light and heat. But the moon, it's called a nur, an inert body that just reflects light. Pretty specific, right? But maybe the most striking claim the author presents is this one. He points to a verse that says, "I built the heaven with power, and it is I who am expanding it." Now think about that. He directly links that statement to the 20th century astronomical discovery that our universe is in fact expanding. And that just brings us right back to that big central question the source material keeps asking. How could knowledge like this, which was totally unknown at the time, find its way into a 7th century text? It's a question the author poses again and again. Okay, let's bring it back down to our own planet and see how the source analyzes verses that have to do with geology and the water cycle. The book draws this really sharp contrast between old myths about where water comes from and the description in the Quran. You had brilliant thinkers, even as late as the 17th century, believing in these mystical underground abysses. But the source argues the Quranic description, rainwater seeping into the ground to feed springs, is a perfect match for how we understand hydrology today. And check this out. This is another key point from the source. The Quran describes mountains using the word autad, which literally means stakes or pegs, like the ones you'd use to anchor a tent. The author connects this directly to the modern geological discovery that mountain ranges actually have these deep roots that go way down, stabilizing the Earth's tectonic plates. All right, now let's shift gears and look at the life sciences. The book spends a lot of time here, arguing that the Quran contains these remarkably detailed and accurate descriptions of how humans reproduce. So, the author argues that the Quran lays out these stages of embryonic development with what he calls startling accuracy. He interprets the verses as describing a clinging entity that implants in the womb, which then becomes a chewed lump, which is actually what an embryo can look like, before the bones form, and only then are they covered by muscles. And it's not just embryology. The text also points to a description of how milk is produced in cattle. The source claims this verse perfectly reflects the biological process, where nutrients from food are absorbed into the blood from the intestines and then carried to the mammary glands. Now, a huge part of Dr. Bucaille's argument actually involves a direct head-to-head comparison between stories found in both the Bible and the Quran, all viewed through this lens of modern science. And this table really lays out the core differences the author highlights. He argues that where the Bible, for instance, describes a flood that covered the entire world or a creation sequence that puts Earth before the sun, the Quran talks about a localized flood affecting only Noah's people and gives no specific order for creation. According to the author, this helps it avoid any scientific contradictions.
But this point about the pharaoh, this is one the author finds particularly significant. While the Bible says the pharaoh was swallowed by the sea, the Quran adds a detail that his body would be saved as a sign. Bukai then presents the actual well-preserved mummy of Merneptah, who is thought to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, as physical evidence that he believes backs up the Quranic account.
So, after all that, cosmology, geology, biology, the comparisons, what's the final takeaway? Where does all of this research lead? Well, it really all boils down to this. By presenting this huge collection of evidence, from the expansion of the universe down to the development of an embryo, the author concludes that the data points away from a human origin and towards a divine one for the Quran. And this final quote from the book really sums up the author's entire position. Bukai asserts that the scientific content within the Quran, combined with the fact that it doesn't have the scientific errors common for its time, makes it impossible to explain through conventional, human-based reasoning alone. And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over. No matter what your perspective is, when you see an ancient text seeming to line up with modern science, it really does make you stop and think. It raises these deep questions about how we interpret both ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.